So let's talk through some armoured war machines, dedicated transports, and lumbering battle tanks of Warhammer 40k with an overview of 7 of the strongest vehicles in the game at the moment. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Warhammer 40k vehicles, and in this video I thought it could be fun to run down a rough overview of 7 of the strongest vehicle units in game currently. I feel like in 10th edition in general, Games Workshop has maybe evened the score a little bit between vehicles and infantry units, perhaps with a little bit less stacked synergy on core infantry units compared with 9th, vehicles are having a bit more of a time to shine. And I feel like at least for the most part, a lot of armies have got a fairly good balance going where you might want some vehicles in the army but not to run 100% tanks or things, which for the most part I think is in a fairly good shape. Some vehicle choices definitely stick out above the rest of the pack though, and for this one I thought I'd talk through 7 of what are in my opinion some of the strongest picks in Warhammer 40k right now, very loosely ranked in an order of one to the next, though in reality obviously it's a bit meaningless to compare completely different vehicles that do different things for entirely different armies. I thought we could just run through a bunch of vehicles in order and roughly what makes them good in game right now. To keep things interesting, I'll talk through no more than one vehicle per faction, and finish up with just a few thoughts about honourable mentions for the other factions that I might not have quite put onto this list, though it's not to say that they don't have strong vehicle choices. First up, we're starting with the dread despoilers of the Chaos Knights, and I thought it was well worth talking about the Chaos Knight War Dog Karnivore, definitely seeming to be near auto-include in most Chaos Knight lists. Now it's all the way down to 140 points for the brutal Chaos Knight with the Slaughter Claw and Chain Talon. In the last points update, Games Workshop for some reason decided to flip this from the very most expensive of the War Dogs, besides the Moirax, to the very cheapest, and given that it was already seeing play at 160 points, it kind of stands to reason that it's even more standout than before. The vast majority of top placing Chaos Knight lists tend to run at least a few of these, though I feel like beyond the first few you might be a bit more tempted to flip into a few more ranged knights after that, just given that dedicated melee maybe has some slightly diminishing returns as you might start move blocking your own models and stopping everyone getting charges. There's absolutely loads to like about the Karnivore though. It's a fast moving war dog at 14-inch move, which is very good for getting onto midfield objectives pretty much straight away. It's going to be annoying for the opponent to try and outrange it, and they'd have to hang really quite far back in their deployment zone to make sure that you couldn't charge them, particularly as it does have reliable charges as well as it gets to re-roll them innately. The War Dogs are all objective control 8, so are excellent for scrapping over midfield objectives. This guy wants to be right on the front line, and for 140 points I think he's got a respectable enough defensive profile. 12 wounds at toughness 10 with a 3+ save and 5+ invulnerable, particularly in context of a wider Chaos Knight army when the enemy anti-tank's going to be stretched. I think that's good enough. This one's mainly all about the melee, but it does get a Stubber or Havoc launcher as well, not too bad for chewing through a few enemy troops. If you do have quite a lot of Havoc launchers on the board, then you can get some at least fairly respectable indirect fire going, though I still think the Stubber is pretty much fine really, getting a nice 6 shots within 18 inches. In combat it has some absolutely brutal melee, 6 attacks at strength 12 AP3 and damage d6+2, all hitting on a 2+ as well no less. Your odds on to kill most standard battle tanks in the game, anything that's toughness 11 or less with a 3+ save. Definitely no slouch against lighter infantry as well, 12 attacks at strength 8, AP2 and damage 1 is rather brutal as well, and tank shock's definitely a possibility given the strength 12 that it has. It's just not all that common for units this cheap to be this much of a threat to virtually every unit that they charge into in the game. Overall, it's just got a lot going for it. It's nice and cheap so you can have it scrapping on front objectives and not worry too much if you lose it. Jumping into combat means the maximum amount of enemy units are going to be in dread range and taking battle shock tests. Could give you the option to use the Terror Shades as well, and its one command point stratagem to walk through walls is really quite handy, meaning that pesky ruins might not get in the way and the opponent can't rely on them for safety. Overall, it's a rather great Chaos Knight right now, but there are plenty of other good ones out there. Brigands are still rather awesome despite the points increase. The Stalker and Huntsman for 150 is quite nice to pair some OK melee with a Demon Breath Spear, and perhaps the Rampager and Desecrator are some of the better ones out of the big knights. In 6th place we've got the brutal tank hunter that is the Gladiator Lancer. Despite a points increase and lots of other points being shifted around, I feel like it still perhaps is one of the standout choices out of Codex Space Marines, though I will admit I don't really think it's so far ahead of the competition now. I feel like you could easily nominate things like the Repulsor Executioner, Ballistus Dreadnought, or Redemptor Dreadnought in its place as one of the best Space Marine units, and you still wouldn't really be wrong. Some of those might be particularly nice as well in things like the Ironstorm Spearhead. The Gladiator Lancer I think is just hard to go too far wrong with just some thrown in absolutely maximal anti-tank damage at long range. It's really reliable with its big rerolls built in, and you don't need to use Oath of Moment on it necessarily. 2 shots to 72-inch range with strength 14, AP 4 and damage d6 plus 3, rerolling 1 hit roll, wound roll and damage roll, and that averages around about 10 wounds to 3+ save vehicles without an invulnerable save. They will obviously be kind of swingy depending on how many shots get through. It does have a few small arms for chipping in against lighter infantry as well, and it is kind of nice with the buffs available from the Ironstorm Spearhead. There's maybe a little bit less necessary that you have those than some of the other vehicles that I've just mentioned. Black Templars are quite nice for it as well, given that they can get a multi-melter for 5 points over the Stubber, a much scarier gun for a small upgrade price there. Compared with the others, I feel like the Lancer might still have the arguable crown, given that it's just so general purpose and doesn't require extra buffs outside of it. In a vacuum, it does add up to the best anti-tank damage compared with the rest of those, though it is less durable per point than any of the others, so it does need to hang back a bit and stay safe. Next up in 5th place, I've chosen to rank the Tau Tetras. Pretty much auto-includes in competitive Tau lists these days, and I'd argue the very strongest Forge World unit in the entire game of Warhammer 40k right now. Tetras are a Forge World unit that are perhaps just so focused and dedicated in role that they do seem to have repeatedly been one of the stronger choices for Tau over the years. Tau generally need Marker Light support. Tetras have usually had some sort of rule of providing better Marker Light support than most due to their high intensity Marker Light beams, and they're generally really quite fast, cheap and expendable due to not having any damage threat pretty much whatsoever. They only have a couple of pulse rifles. Currently in the Imperial Armor Index, it's 80 points for 2 of these guys. They have the Marker Light keyword when they're acting as a spotter for the Tau unit that they're guiding, giving them a +1 to hit, ignores cover, and potentially sustained hits too if you're in Cao Yon already. In general, you do want units that can spot for each other, and these are already at least a fairly cheap way of doing that. Really good on things like crisis suits and broadsides, maybe other things like sky rays or riptides or something. Tetras really take it to the next level though, as well as that they also allow full rerolls to hit on top of it, meaning that the damage boost they give to their unit that they're guiding is just absolutely astronomical. If you say had a unit of crisis suits that was hitting on a 4+, then they'd usually give you a 78% damage boost on top of their normal expected output. That's both between the guiding and the rerolls. For things like a bigger unit of crisis suits or broadsides, that absolutely justifies the Tetras inclusion in the list at 80 points. Never mind the fact that they might have a bit more value on top of that. They're genuinely actually quite tough as Tau go. 14 wounds at toughness 7 with a 4+ save is pretty good for 80 points, and they also get to infiltrate, so they could start on the midfield, getting good lines of sight on anything that they need to mark, or if it made sense they could potentially do some interesting manoeuvres turn 1 in the game. Perhaps move blocking some slow-moving melee vehicles or something. Not really too hard to see why just about every competitive Tau list is running some of these, despite being kind of hard to obtain and a bit more costly than most being Forge World. That's not to say that Tau lists don't have a lot of competition for good vehicles though. The Hammerhead and maybe particularly the Sky Ray are very nice out of the tanks. Since Devilfish got so cheap, they're excellent transports now, and Piranhas are nice nuisance vehicles as well, and come with their Seeker missiles built in. Battlesuits all technically count as vehicles as well at the moment, so you could talk about most of those as well if you wanted to. In 4th place, I've chosen to rank the trusty Orc Trukk. Again, pretty much ubiquitous in Orc armies, and Orcs are really quite strong in game right now. In the past, it's often made sense to load Orcs into more things like battle wagons or kill rigs, but Trukks seem to be the order of the day at the moment. 60 points are just really quite cheap for their defensive profile, and they do everything that you want a transport to do without wasting points on other things like damage dealing weapons. For the 60 points, I feel like the defensive profile again is pretty solid. Toughness 8, 10 wounds and a 4+ save is very good for that amount of cost. They'll generally need some dedicated anti-tank weapons or at least some mid-strength fire to bring them down, and they even have a 6+ invulnerable save, so they've got the chance to bounce back melter shots, and if they're left injured but not destroyed, they gradually regenerate health as well due to grot riggers. They transport 12 models and can transport mega knobs around as well. They've got a firing deck of 12, which I guess could be handy for flash gits if they wanted to stay embarked. And while they don't really have any significant damage output with that wildly inaccurate big shooter, the Wrecking Ball's still interesting enough in combat, maybe more because it allows tank shock at strength 10 more than anything else. You could average 4 mortal wounds on a unit that you're attacking there. Trucks are generally really quite popular in Orky armies right now. Most lists seem to run around about 2 to 4 of them, though some run more. And there's various things that you can put in them as pretty strong contents. 10 knobs with power claws and a war boss is a very popular option. You could do the same with regular boys. 10 beast snaggers with a beast boss is quite nice, or you could have 10 flash gits with Badrock to jump out to the front and then light something up. Mega Knobs are pretty solid as well. Finally, if you do happen to roll for them to explode, they've got an interesting stratagem called Kareen as well, which is situational but can be big when it comes up. If the enemy shoots down one of these and then it explodes, for 1 CP you get to make a normal move or a fallback move before it goes. Potentially absolutely massively important if it gets you to move the Trukk forward and then jump out the boys somewhere either a bit safer or a bit closer to the enemy. Or in the right situation, it could mean that your Trukk could just drive full tilt towards the heart of the enemy army before it blows up and shower them in a bunch more mortal wounds. It is Deadly Demise D3. If you would catch, say, 4 enemy units in that blast, then that's an average of 8 mortal wounds there. Otherwise, just as being a very cheap and expendable transport could be great for nuisance charges, or just generally getting in the opponent's way. Next up, and the one I've chosen to rank in 3rd place, we're sticking with transports, and I thought I'd talk about the Leagues of Votan Sagitaur. This one's a lot more of a high-tech and threatening transport than the trusty Trukk, and again seems to be pretty much auto-include in Leagues of Votan lists at the moment. It's not like they've got the biggest roster in the world, but the vast majority of competitive lists tend to go at least fairly heavy on the Sagitaurs. I think the transport is easily good enough just to be spammed for its stats alone. Some of the time it looks like people are literally just taking units so they can take more Sagitaurs rather than the other way around. I've seen some people using Grimnirs in them rather than split Hearthkin squads, getting a bit more Votan psychic damage on the battlefield. Like most Votan, it's a little bit short ranged compared with some, but it does move quite quickly. It gets a 6-inch scout move pre-game that you could use to help get range on the enemy, or perhaps duck behind cover if it made sense, a 12-inch regular move for getting some lines of sight, and then some at least fairly sturdy defense at 10 wounds, toughness 9 and a 3+ save. Maybe not stand out good and will get wrecked by dedicated anti-tank fairly quickly, but for just 100 points I think that's an absolutely fine stat line. The toughness 10 does make it not trivial to take down with things like melter weapons. Its guns are probably the most impressive bit though. It gets 3 attacks with those bolt cannons out the front, 3 shots at strength 6, AP 1 and damage 2, and twin linked to reroll the wound rolls. That should chip away against some lighter infantry. And then the main events are either the missile launchers or the high las beams on the top hatch. I feel like both of those are at least fairly even in value at the moment. The high las beams get you 2 big shots hitting on a 4+, a strength 12 AP3, damage D6, and sustained hits D3. That one's the better option against toughness 10 or better vehicles. Or you've got the option for the missile launchers, 2 strength 12 shots at a flat damage 3, plus a backup missile launcher that has a frag or crack type firing mode. This one works out as a bit better against most infantry by a little bit, but a bit worse against tanks. They're both very usable though. On top of that though, given that the Leagues of Votan mark 4 big enemy threats with their judgment tokens early game, it means that you could have big focus fire from the Sagitaurs to break them down. Say for example, if you had 3 Sagitaurs for just 300 points moving up the board, and they all had the high las beam cannons, if they shot at something like a toughness 11 3+ save vehicle, then with a +1 to hit and +1 to wound from the pre-game judgment mark, you'd average around about 15 wounds damage towards it. That's not even counting the bolt cannons or anything. Otherwise, it's kind of handy just for splitting up Hearthkin squads to give you smaller units to take objectives rather than having to commit to a full 10 of them on one point, and it can be a reasonable option for delivering berserks into melee as well if you want to run some of those. Overall, I'd say it's very, very strong. I'd probably rate it just slightly above the Hexon Land Fortress, but really not by much. That thing is just great value for 225 points as well, maybe particularly good for the Votan Sustained Hits 2 stratagem for some very big firepower. Next up, in 2nd place, I've chosen to rank the Chaos Space Marine Forgefiend, 180 points, so it has gone up 20 on the previous incarnation, but it doesn't really seem to have hindered it all that much, and Chaos Space Marine lists are stomping tournaments these days, often with these guys in pride of place. The Forgefiends are 12 wounds at toughness 10 with a 3+ save and a 5+ invulnerable. Overall not really that tough compared with the other options, though the Nurgle one can be protected. I still say it's not awful for the cost though, you're going to need some dedicated long-range firepower to shot them down. The massively preferred loadout is the triple ectoplasma cannon. This will give you 3d3 shots at strength 10, AP 3 and damage 3, a nice respectable profile for dealing with just about anything really. Maybe struggling a little bit against toughness 11 and more, but anything lower is going to really feel that, particularly Terminators. The individual blasts mean that it's actually genuinely quite good at killing hordes as well. You get +12 shots given that they're 3 different blasts against a 20 strong unit, and of course those blasts will hit the enemies really quite hard. If it makes sense, you can make those guns all hazardous for devastating wounds as well. Might not always be necessary, but if the enemy's got some high invulnerable saves, then it probably is worth it, and particularly if you're Chaos on Dividers. What really takes the numbers from good to great, though, are the dart packs and the marks. The dart packs allow you to choose either sustained or lethal hits at the chance of taking some mortal wounds from leadership. If the Forgefiend isn't Nurgle marked, lethal hits is enormous against toughness 11 or more. In general, the decision seems to be between the Mark of Nurgle and the Mark of Chaos Undivided for competitive lists, and many lists choose to run one of each. The Mark of Nurgle gives you sustained hits on a 5+, usually that's just a 50% extra damage boost from using a Dark Pack there, and also allows you access to the 1 command point stratagem to make it untargetable outside of 12 inches, pretty much fire support that your opponent can't do anything about. Otherwise, the Mark of Chaos Undivided allows you to reroll 1s when you're using a Dark Pact. That's really quite nice when combined with the lethal hits, to make that one just a bit better against toughness 11 or more compared with the Nurgle one on average. Though if you really want to lean into the damage, then it's 1 command point for 4 rerolls to hit and to wound. That's absolutely excellent with the devastating wounds, and if you needed to take down a great big vehicle with a super high save or a big invulnerable save, that would be the way to go. Overall, they're just murderously efficient Dinobot gun turrets, and they can get some further buffs if you invest even more in them. Abaddon can give you full hit rerolls even if you're not undivided. That could be very big with the Dark Packs, and Hell Brutes could even allow you to double up on those Dark Packs as well, though by that point you are getting into a massive amount of investment for them. Perhaps not too surprising to see these crop up in the vast majority of Chaos Space Marine lists. I'd say in terms of main competition for them, I'd probably just rank the standard Chaos Space Marine Rhino with a Mark of Nurgle as the next best, using that 1 command point stratagem to make it untargetable when you're guarding a massive squad full of Chosen and a Chaos Lord is a very scary threat. Finally, we come to our Eldari Overlords, and the vehicle that I've chosen to rank as the strongest vehicle in Warhammer 40k at the moment is the Night Spinner, 180 points worth of scary monofilament artillery. And I feel like these guys have got some pretty good claim to that title, given that the vast majority of competitive Eldari lists seem to run around about 2 of these, and Eldari are the single strongest army at the game at the moment, with the best win rate and winning the most tournaments. I feel like out of about any of the nerfs that Eldari got in the last balanced data slate, the Night Spinner maybe got off the single lightest. It was one of their strongest competitive units already, and it only went up from 170 points to 180 points when other things went up far more proportionally. The Grav tank has the fairly standard stat line, 12 wounds at toughness 9 with a 3+ save, not particularly tough for 180 points, but in general you wouldn't really need or want to expose it to enemy shooting. Like all Eldar though, it can be very fast if it needs to be. It can go 14 inches if you wanted to make a late game dash for lines of sight to just deal as much damage as possible, or to get to midfield objectives if that was needed. That could potentially be the best choice for it later on. Its damage output maybe looks a little bit unassuming for an 180 points vehicle, but it really does add up to quite a lot. D6 plus 3 shots, hitting on a 3+, all at strength 7, AP 0 and damage 2, with blast, devastating wounds and twin links. On average you tend to get around about 1 devastating wound shot through just with standard rolling, plus probably a couple of other wounds at the AP 0, and a Farseer could potentially throw in another dice to make a Strands of Fate roll a 6, so if you had a Farseer nearby you could have this thing pretty reliably doing around about 2 devastating wounds to a unit per turn, maybe with a little bit more stacked saves. It means that say a firebase of say 2 of these in your deployment zone hidden nice and safe with a Farseer nearby should have a fairly good chance of just one-rounding something like a standard squad of Space Marines that was sat on an objective, particularly with the blast word giving them a few more shots. That's quite a powerful threat that could really mess with the enemy scoring, or just punish the single most important and valuable unit in their army list that would otherwise be safe from your retribution, and just take something very dangerous off the board. Perhaps just as importantly though, depending on the enemy army and matchup, is the ability to slow down enemy units. When these things shoot, then the enemy unit that they hit get a -2 to move, advance and charge, and unlike some other units that's not just limited to enemy infantry or anything. It can affect big tanks and even titanic units, and particularly if the opponent's got some slightly slow moving melee units on the board, then this could be enough to genuinely just keep them entirely out of the game for a turn or two, particularly with the big movement that Eldar have normally. You could also use it for a squad that looked like it would easily be able to make it onto an objective one turn, and the Night Spinner hitting them with this could basically just say no, and even with an advanced move it makes it entirely impossible to say make it onto a midfield objective. Eldari definitely have plenty of strong competition though. Anything with high power anti-tank weapons tends to be great with them due to those big battle host rerolls. After the points adjustments, it feels like maybe War Walkers and Fire Prisms are perhaps the most standout out of any of them. The Warwalkers love the rerolls and use them very efficiently, and are pretty good with their shield generators, giving them some debuffs to enemy wound rolls. And 5 Prisms can do some gamey tricks by lining up lines of sight with 3 of them from one tank, and also have their own built-in hit rolls as well, so will basically reroll all hits and wounds with their main gun, which is devastatingly powerful. In any case, let me know what you make of the 7 strongest vehicles in Warhammer 40k. If you're interested, here are just a few thoughts on some of the best choices for some of the other factions. Plenty of other good stuff out there, of course. I thought I'd try and keep it fairly focused to just a few of the more common picks though. Perhaps out of this list, for very standout stuff, I feel like Bjorn the Fell-Handed for the Space Wolves might not have been too far behind. The Caladius Grav Tank for the Custodes, I still rate as perhaps one of their strongest units right now, given that it didn't receive nerfs when the rest of the army did. And beyond that, I feel like there's plenty of other interesting things of greater or lesser power. Feel free to let me know if you think that any of these should have been on the list, or any other choices from other factions that are not mentioned. Let me know what you make of your vehicles in your army in 40k though, what's been working out well for you, and what terrors have you encountered on the other side of the table. Look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments as per always. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to have new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.